John Harrington had always been a man of quiet routines, the kind of man who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of ranch life. The Montana winters were harsh, the nights long, and for years, he had endured the solitude of his sprawling property, the silence only broken by the lowing of cattle or the wind whistling through the bare trees. Yet this year, John had decided it was time for a change. He would not face another Christmas alone. After months of careful correspondence, he had arranged for Mei Ling, a woman from China he had never met in person, to join him for the holiday. He imagined her delicate features, her elegant hands, and the way she might transform his lonely cabin into a place of warmth and laughter. The thought made his chest tighten with a mixture of hope and nervous anticipation. When the day arrived, the air was crisp and biting, and the ranch looked as bleak as John feared. The barn roof groaned under the weight of ice, and the cattle huddled together, their breaths fogging in the cold air. John's hands were rough from the work he had done that morning, and yet he barely noticed the chill as he waited by the gate, scanning the road for any sign of the approaching car. Then, a sleek vehicle appeared, carrying with it the hope he had pinned on a perfect Christmas. Mei Ling stepped out, her small figure wrapped in a long coat, her dark hair framing her face, and for a moment, John could hardly believe she was real. Her smile was shy but genuine, and she bowed slightly, greeting him with words he only partially understood. The first hours were awkward. Mei Ling's English was limited, and John's attempts at conversation often ended in puzzled silence. But as he watched her move through the snow-covered yard, he began to notice something unexpected. Her eyes were sharp, observant, always scanning, always measuring. She didn't linger over the decorations or comment on the gifts he had prepared. Instead, she walked straight to the barn, inspecting the beams, the feed, and the water troughs with a quiet intensity that made John pause. When he finally asked what she thought, expecting a compliment, she said simply, "Barn weak. Cattle need better water. Snow too heavy. Can fix." John laughed nervously, thinking she must be joking. "It's fine," he said. "It's always like this in winter." But Mei Ling didn't smile or correct him gently. She simply reached into her bag and produced small tools, ropes, and odd-looking devices, and within the next few hours, she began working with a precision and knowledge that astonished him. She identified cracks in the beams, suggested changes to the cattle feeding schedule, and even proposed a way to prevent the ice from freezing the water supply. John's heart raced, not with romantic anticipation, as he had expected, but with the dawning realization that this quiet woman might save his ranch from ruin. By the end of the day, John felt a mix of awe and relief. He had come to Christmas expecting a companion, someone to bring warmth to his home and perhaps charm to his life. Instead, he had received something far more valuable: skill, insight, and a partner capable of seeing problems and solving them with quiet efficiency. The snow outside seemed less oppressive, the wind less biting, and John knew, for the first time in years, that this Christmas would be unforgettable, not for the gift he had imagined, but for the salvation he had never anticipated. The morning after Mei Ling's first day on the ranch, John woke to the sound of activity outside. He pulled on his boots, wrapping his coat tightly around his broad shoulders, and stepped into the crisp Montana air, expecting the usual routine of checking fences and feeding the cattle. But the sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Mei Ling was already out in the fields, moving with a calm efficiency that seemed almost impossible in the biting cold. She had arranged small clay pots along the pasture, carefully filling them with a fine powder John had never seen before. The snow gleamed under the weak winter sun, but she moved as if the cold did not touch her, her motions deliberate and precise. "Morning," John called cautiously, unsure how to approach her unusual activity. "What are you doing now?" Mei Ling looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Soil better. Grass grows stronger. Cattle healthy," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for argument. John scratched his head, uncertain whether to be impressed or skeptical. "Stronger grass. How does that work?" Mei Ling smiled faintly and continued her work without answering immediately, demonstrating a quiet confidence that both frustrated and intrigued him. Despite his doubts, he felt a spark of trust. Something about her presence suggested she knew more than she let on. As he watched, a few local ranchers rode by, bundled in coats and scarves, muttering to each other and laughing quietly. "What's she doing, John?" "Planting magic," one called, shaking his head in disbelief. John ignored them, sensing that this was not a time for outsiders' opinions. By mid-morning, Mei Ling had moved to the barn, opening a dusty chest and pulling out ropes, nets, and a wooden device John had never seen before. She spent hours reorganizing the barn, explaining in broken English how to maximize airflow, protect the cattle from disease, and keep the animals warm during the harsh winter nights. She demonstrated feeding rotations, tethering methods, and even adjustments to the water supply that would prevent freezing. John could only stare in astonishment, realizing that she was transforming the ranch, one detail at a time, with a skill and precision he had never possessed. "Trust me," she said, tying a complicated knot that John had never learned. "Animals breathe better, stay warm, less sick." John rubbed his eyes and shook his head, marveling at her expertise. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked, genuinely curious. "My mother taught me, then traveled, see other farms, learn, now help you," Mei Ling replied calmly, as if solving impossible problems was nothing unusual. By afternoon, John noticed subtle but remarkable changes. The air inside the barn felt lighter, the cattle calmer, and even the oldest steer, stubborn and weak for months, stood taller, chewing with renewed vigor. The snow outside, harsh and unyielding, seemed less threatening. John's anticipation of a wife who would sit by the fire and sip tea was replaced by awe at the practical knowledge she had brought into his life. This Christmas had not delivered the fantasy he had imagined, it had delivered something far more valuable: hope, renewal, and the assurance that his ranch could survive the harshest winter yet. By the time evening fell, John felt a strange mixture of humility and gratitude. Mei Ling had not just arrived as a companion, she had arrived as a savior, someone whose quiet competence was already reshaping his life and securing his future. He realized that perhaps the greatest gifts did not arrive in ribbons or packages, but in the skill, wisdom, and determination of those who quietly refused to give up. The next morning, a fierce windstorm swept across the Montana plains, catching John off guard. The sky was dark with swirling clouds, snow flying sideways, and the cold bit through even the thickest layers of clothing. John had weathered winter storms before, but this one arrived faster and harsher than any he remembered. The cattle stamped nervously in the pasture, their hooves breaking the snow crust, and John could see that the old fences were trembling under the force of the wind. Panic began to rise in his chest, and he rushed outside, shouting orders to the few ranch hands he had, but it was clear that human strength alone might not be enough to prevent disaster. Mei Ling appeared beside him as if summoned by instinct, her calm presence cutting through the chaos. "Do not panic," she said, her voice steady against the roar of the storm. "We fix. Together." John froze, taken aback. Together. In the middle of this storm, he had no idea how she could possibly help. But the conviction in her eyes left him no choice but to follow her lead. "All right," he said, gripping a rope tightly, "show me what to do." Mei Ling immediately took command. She instructed the hands to anchor the weakened fence posts, demonstrating a technique John had never seen. She tied knots with incredible speed and precision, adjusted tension lines, and even suggested temporary windbreaks using fallen branches and spare lumber. Her calm focus seemed to radiate into the men around her, and slowly, the chaos outside became organized. Then the unthinkable happened. A heavy branch, cracked by the storm, broke from a nearby tree and slammed into the barn roof. John's heart sank. Years of labor and effort threatened to collapse in an instant. But Mei Ling didn't hesitate. She retrieved a portable toolkit from her bag and began shoring up the damaged beams, using braces and supports in a method that seemed both simple and ingenious. John watched, amazed, as she worked tirelessly, her small frame moving with confidence and purpose, transforming disaster into stability. By nightfall, the barn, though battered, stood firm, the cattle sheltered safely inside, their lowing calmer than it had been all day. John leaned against a fence post, shivering, exhausted, and bewildered by what he had witnessed. "How do you do this?" he asked, voice hoarse with awe. "How can you stay so calm and fix everything in the middle of a storm?" Mei Ling looked at him, brushing snow from her hair. "Practice. Observation. Listen to land. Land tells problem. People panic. People miss problem," she said simply. John felt a wave of humility wash over him. He had spent years trying to control the ranch, to bend nature and circumstance to his will, but he often overlooked the subtle cues, the quiet signs of imbalance. Mei Ling's approach was not just skill, it was attentiveness, patience, and harmony with the land he had struggled to master. When the storm finally passed, the ranch appeared almost untouched. The cattle were calm, the fences secured, and the barn solid. John realized something profound. He had expected a Christmas filled with companionship, perhaps a warm smile beside the fire, but instead, he had been given resilience, expertise, and the quiet strength to survive even the worst challenges. This Christmas, he understood, was not about what he imagined, it was about what he desperately needed. Winter had begun to loosen its grip when John received troubling news. A rival rancher from the neighboring county had purchased the grazing rights along the river that ran past John's property. Without access to that water, his cattle would struggle to survive, the pastures would dry out, and all the progress he and Mei Ling had made could be undone. John felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a mix of fear and frustration. He had expected Christmas to bring companionship and warmth, not new crises. He stomped across the snow-covered yard, imagining legal battles, bitter disputes, and the loss of everything he had worked for. Mei Ling walked quietly beside him, her face serene and untroubled despite the chaos in his mind. "Problem," she said simply. "Not too late." John stopped and stared at her. "Not too late. Mei Ling, he's powerful. Has lawyers, and influence. What can we do?" She crouched in the snow, drawing lines and shapes with a stick. Her hands were steady, and her movements precise. "Observe river. Observe land. Work with nature, not against. Find new path. Save water," she explained, pointing to the curves of the frozen creek and the way the snowmelt pooled in shallow channels. Desperate and running out of options, John followed her instructions. Together, they led the ranch hands to the overlooked portion of the river, where the water trickled slowly into a dry creek bed. Mei Ling measured and marked the best spots to dig channels that would redirect the flow safely onto John's pastures. She planned the channels carefully, ensuring that the water would reach the most parched areas without breaking laws or provoking the rival. Shovels bit into frozen soil, and hands worked tirelessly under her guidance. By the end of the day, the irrigation system was complete, clever, simple, and perfectly functional. "See," Mei Ling said, stepping back to survey her work. "River still yours. Cattle still safe." John felt a rush of relief, and with it, pride, not in himself but in Mei Ling. She had thought faster, acted with precision, and anticipated problems he hadn't even noticed. His vision of a bride who would sip cocoa by the fire had been replaced by admiration for a woman whose intelligence, patience, and determination were saving his livelihood. Within days, the local ranchers began noticing the results. Cattle were healthy, pastures lush, and water flowing smoothly. Whispers of admiration spread through the valley. Even the rival rancher came to inspect the channels, clearly baffled by the ingenuity of the setup. "Didn't think you'd manage," he admitted grudgingly. "Looks like you beat me at my own game." John simply smiled, glancing at Mei Ling, who quietly adjusted a channel and checked the water flow. He understood now that she had not just solved the immediate problem, she had transformed his approach to the land, teaching him to observe, anticipate, and work with nature rather than against it. This Christmas, he had expected companionship, but he had received something far more lasting: partnership, resilience, and the knowledge that with the right guidance, even impossible challenges could be overcome. As the sun set behind the hills, John and Mei Ling stood side by side, watching the water flow steadily through the channels. He realized that while he had expected gifts wrapped in ribbons, the true gift had been skill, patience, and quiet wisdom, the very things that had saved his ranch from ruin and would ensure its future. Spring had finally arrived, melting the last patches of stubborn snow and revealing the ranch in all its renewed glory. The once barren fields now sprouted thick green grass, the cattle grazed peacefully, and the barns that had barely survived the winter storms stood strong, reinforced by Mei Ling's careful planning. John walked the property, taking in the transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. He had expected Christmas to bring him a companion, someone who might warm his lonely cabin and share quiet evenings by the fire. Instead, he had received something far more valuable, a partner who had saved his ranch and, in a way, saved him. Mei Ling moved through the fields, checking water channels, inspecting fences, and making adjustments with meticulous attention. Her calm, steady presence seemed to breathe life into the land. John watched her silently for a moment, realizing that her work had done more than repair damage or prevent disaster. She had instilled a rhythm and balance into the ranch, an order that he had never been able to achieve on his own. Every trough, every pen, every stretch of pasture reflected her insight, her understanding of the land, and her quiet genius. News of the ranch's revival spread quickly through the neighboring valleys. Local ranchers came to see the transformation, whispering in admiration as they surveyed the lush pastures and healthy livestock. Even the rival who had once threatened John's water supply paid a visit, inspecting the irrigation channels with a skeptical eye. "I didn't think this would work," he admitted begrudgingly, "but you've managed something remarkable here." John simply smiled and gestured toward Mei Ling, who was adjusting a fence post with effortless precision. He knew he could never have achieved this alone. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, John and Mei Ling stood on the porch, watching the cattle graze in the fading light. The air was warm for the first time in months, carrying the faint scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. John handed Mei Ling a steaming cup of cocoa, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a mix of gratitude, admiration, and quiet affection. "I expected a wife for Christmas," he said softly, "but I got more than I could have imagined. You saved this ranch, and you've changed how I see everything." Mei Ling accepted the cup, her dark eyes reflecting the sunset. "Better than gift," she said simply. "Gift lasts, keeps life alive." John realized she was right. This Christmas had delivered a gift far beyond ribbons or trinkets. It had delivered resilience, wisdom, and partnership. Mei Ling's presence had reshaped not only the ranch but also his understanding of what it meant to truly rely on another person. She had taught him that strength could be quiet, guidance could be gentle, and solutions often came in forms he had never expected. As the stars appeared in the night sky, John felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. The ranch thrived, the cattle were safe, and the land was alive again. He understood now that the greatest gifts were not always what we imagine. They were the skills, patience, and courage of someone who stands beside us when we need it most. Mei Ling had arrived as a bride, but she had become the heart, mind, and hands that saved his life's work. And for the first time in years, John smiled fully, knowing that some gifts, unexpected, unassuming, and powerful, truly last a lifetime.